The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon as Mr. James Thompson stepped out of his small apartment. His steps were slow, but steady, as they always were. At 78, his body had begun to show the wear of time, but his spirit remained unshaken. His graying hair and deeply wrinkled skin were evidence of a life well lived. James had seen a lot in his day, too much, perhaps. He'd fought in wars, witnessed countless changes in the world, and had long since learned how to navigate through the struggles life threw his way. Now he lived quietly, a retired military veteran, content with his modest routine. Today, he had planned a simple trip to the local grocery store. There wasn't much on his list, just a few essentials: milk, bread, and eggs. He made the walk every week, a small but important ritual that connected him to his neighborhood. It was a routine that gave him comfort, even as he watched the world around him change faster than he could keep up with. Sometimes he wondered if things were better when they were simpler, but he didn't complain. Life had never been easy, but he had always made the best of it. As he reached the corner near the market, he noticed a police car parked nearby. The officer sitting inside seemed young, his uniform crisp, and his eyes focused on something in the distance. James gave a small nod as he passed by, not thinking much of it at first. But as he took another step, he heard the sharp sound of a car door opening. The young officer called out to him, "Hey, you! Stop right there." James turned slowly, his old joints creaking. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, scrutinizing him. Something about the way the officer spoke made James uneasy. He had dealt with authority his whole life, but the way this officer looked at him felt different. It wasn't the usual respectful glance he'd grown used to from law enforcement in his day. This one felt judgmental, as if he were being seen as less than what he was. The officer walked up to him with a purposeful stride, his eyes narrowing as he took in James' worn-out clothes and cane. Without a greeting, the officer spoke again, his voice sharp. "You know you're walking too slow for this area, right? You shouldn't be hanging around here." James stood there for a moment, surprised. He wasn't doing anything wrong, just walking like he had for years. But the officer's tone was demanding, almost like an accusation. He wanted to say something, to explain himself, but he knew that speaking up might make things worse. Instead, he straightened his back as best as he could, refusing to let the officer see his discomfort. "I'm just going to the store, officer," James replied in his calmest voice. "I'm not causing any trouble." But the officer wasn't satisfied with his answer. He stepped even closer, invading James' personal space, and gave him a dismissive look, as if James' presence was an inconvenience. His words grew colder. "You think you can just walk around here whenever you feel like it?" The officer snapped. "Maybe you should take your time somewhere else, old man." James felt his heart race for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. He had been through far worse in his life than this young officer's rude remarks. He had seen battles, and he had survived things far more difficult than this. Yet, in that moment, standing face to face with this officer, he couldn't help but feel a sting. The disrespect was sharp, like a slap in the face. He looked the officer in the eyes, trying to remain calm. He had learned over the years that showing any kind of weakness only made people like this officer more confident. But something in the officer's demeanor made him pause. This was no simple misunderstanding. Something was off. And as he stood there, waiting for the officer to speak again, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeper going on, something he didn't yet understand. James stood there, his mind racing, but his face remained calm. The officer's presence was overwhelming, and his words cut through the air like an unexpected storm. James had been through so much in his life, but for some reason, this moment felt different. The young officer's glare was unrelenting, and James could feel the tension between them growing. The officer's hand rested on his belt, where his baton hung, and James couldn't help but notice how much more aggressive the officer's stance had become. He was no longer just a law enforcement officer. Now he seemed to be a force, a presence that demanded respect without earning it. The veteran could feel his age creeping into his body, making him feel even more vulnerable. He took a slow, deep breath, trying to focus on the situation at hand. "I don't want any trouble," James said, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of weariness. "I'm just trying to get to the store. I don't mean any harm." The officer's eyes narrowed even further, and for a moment, James wondered if the young man even heard what he had said. The officer's face remained hard, his posture rigid as if he was trying to make some sort of point. James thought to himself that this officer clearly had no respect for his age or the wisdom that came with it. The younger generation, it seemed, had little understanding of what it meant to have served, to have been a part of something bigger than yourself. "I'm just trying to do my job," the officer finally said, his voice a bit softer but still carrying a tone of superiority. "And you're not making it any easier." James couldn't help but feel the sting of that remark. He had served his country in ways this young man could never understand, and yet here he was, being treated like a problem. He clenched his fists around his cane, but held himself back from saying anything more. He had learned in his life that responding with anger only made things worse. He wasn't about to give this officer the satisfaction of seeing him lose control. The officer took a step back, glancing around as if looking for something. James, for the briefest moment, thought maybe the officer would back down, maybe realize that his treatment of the elderly veteran was unjust. But when the officer's gaze returned to James, it was as cold and dismissive as before. "You've got nothing to prove to me, old man," the officer muttered, his words filled with scorn. "You don't belong here." James' heart sank, but he didn't let it show. He had heard things like this before, from people who didn't know better, or in some cases, didn't care. But there was something about the way this officer said it, so casually, so confidently, that felt like a personal insult. It was at that moment that James decided not to engage any further. He had fought in wars for his country, stood side by side with his comrades in the most dangerous situations. He wasn't about to waste his time defending himself to someone who had no idea who he was. "I'm just going to go," James said, his voice even. He turned slowly, determined to walk away with the same dignity he carried all his life, no matter what had just happened. But as he started to step away, the officer called out again, his voice a bit sharper than before. "Not so fast," the officer said, his tone demanding. "I need to see your ID. I think you might be up to something." James froze. He didn't understand why the officer was suddenly asking for his identification. Wasn't this all just a misunderstanding? He had no idea what this officer was expecting to find, but he knew that in situations like these, everything could escalate very quickly. With a deep sigh, James slowly reached into his coat pocket to pull out his ID, hoping that this would be the end of it. James fumbled with his coat pocket, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The officer's eyes were locked on him, watching his every movement. He could feel the young man's impatience and frustration, as if James had somehow become an inconvenience to him. The air was thick with tension, and for a brief moment, the street around them seemed eerily quiet. James could hear the soft sound of his breath and the distant murmur of voices from a few bystanders who had begun to gather, but everything else felt muffled, like the world had slowed down. With a deep breath, James pulled out his wallet and retrieved his ID, his hands trembling slightly from the nerves that had suddenly overtaken him. He'd been through far worse in his life, but this moment of being questioned and treated with suspicion, felt different. He handed the ID to the officer, his old fingers brushing against the smooth plastic of the card. The officer took it without a word, his fingers gripping the card a little too tightly as he examined it. James couldn't help but feel a pang of frustration. He had never been one to boast about his accomplishments, but he had earned every bit of respect he had ever received. The medals he'd earned during his service, the sacrifices he'd made for this country, none of it seemed to matter to this young officer. In fact, it felt like the officer didn't see him at all for the person he was, but simply as a target of his own prejudice. The officer glanced up at James, his eyes cold and calculating, before returning his gaze to the ID. He studied it with an intensity that made James uncomfortable. For a moment, it seemed like the officer was about to say something harsh again, but then he paused. James could see the hesitation in the officer's face, but it was only brief, a flicker of doubt that quickly vanished. The officer handed back the ID, his expression not softening in the slightest. He didn't apologize, nor did he offer any explanation for his behavior. Instead, he just muttered under his breath, almost as if trying to convince himself that he was in control of the situation. "You're lucky this time," the officer said with a dismissive wave of his hand. "But don't think I won't be keeping an eye on you. People like you are always up to something." James stood still, his mind racing. What did he mean by that? People like him. Was it the color of his skin, or his age? Or was it because he had been a veteran, someone who had seen and experienced things that most others couldn't begin to imagine? It was clear that the officer's words weren't just about the moment. They were about something deeper, something rooted in prejudice. But James didn't let the officer's words get to him. He had learned long ago that some people would never change, no matter how much they were educated or confronted with the truth. He had lived through enough to know that sometimes the only thing you could do was walk away with your head held high, even when it felt like the world was against you. As the officer turned to walk back to his patrol car, James exhaled slowly. He felt the weight of the situation lifting off his shoulders, but it was replaced by a heavy sadness. The young man would never know the sacrifices James had made, the pain he had endured, or the strength it had taken to keep going. All that mattered to the officer was the man standing in front of him, an old, tired veteran, nothing more. James glanced around. The small crowd had dispersed, but a few people still watched from a distance, perhaps shaken by what they had just witnessed. Some looked guilty, others just confused. James didn't care about their reactions. What mattered was that he had survived this encounter, just as he had survived so many others. He took one last look at the officer, his heart heavy with the understanding that this was just another chapter in his life, one that would not define him. He turned and walked toward the store, his steps slow but sure, determined not to let one man's ignorance ruin his day. The world was full of challenges, and he had faced much worse. Today, however, he would walk on, as he always had. James continued his walk to the store, the sound of his cane tapping lightly against the pavement with each step. The encounter with the officer lingered in his mind, but he wasn't about to let it consume him. He had learned long ago that there would always be people who didn't understand, who looked at him through the lens of judgment and ignorance. It was unfortunate, but it wasn't worth getting upset over. He had seen too much in his life to let such things get under his skin. As he passed by the familiar shops and houses, he tried to focus on the small details around him. The way the morning sunlight reflected off the glass windows of the bakery, the scent of fresh bread wafting in the air. These little things always helped him ground himself, to remember that despite the challenges, the world was still full of beauty and peace. He arrived at the grocery store, its familiar bell ringing as he pushed the door open. The store was quiet, as it usually was in the early hours. The shelves were neatly stocked with everything he needed. James made his way through the aisles, picking out the things on his list. Milk, bread, eggs, simple items for a simple day. His hands were steady as he reached for the products, moving with a calm precision born from years of routine. As he walked past the rows of cans and boxes, his thoughts wandered back to the officer. What had driven the young man to treat him with such disdain? Was it just the fact that he was old, or was there something more? James had spent most of his life serving his country, and yet it seemed that his age and appearance were all people saw when they looked at him now. He was just another old man, forgotten by the world, no longer relevant. But that wasn't how James saw himself. He had served in ways few could understand, and his sacrifices had shaped the world in ways that would never be recognized by someone like that officer. He shook his head, pushing those thoughts aside. It wasn't worth dwelling on. As he made his way to the checkout counter, the clerk greeted him with a smile. She was a young woman, probably in her 20s, and she seemed friendly enough. James nodded in return, giving her a small smile. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How are you today?" she asked, scanning his items. "I'm doing well, thank you," he replied, his voice calm but kind. The clerk didn't seem to notice anything unusual about James. She didn't look at him with judgment or disdain, as the officer had. She just saw him as another customer, another person in the world, going about his day. James appreciated that. As he finished paying for his groceries, the clerk handed him his receipt and bag. "Have a nice day, Mr. Thompson." "Thank you," he said, offering her a genuine smile. James stepped out of the store, the weight of the encounter with the officer still lingering in his thoughts, but now he felt more at peace. He had done nothing wrong. He was simply going about his day, living his life, the same way he always had. He wasn't going to let the ignorance of one person cloud his judgment or spoil his mood. As he made his way back home, the sun was higher in the sky now, casting a warm golden glow over the streets. The small neighborhood felt familiar and safe. People were out walking their dogs. Children were playing on the sidewalk, and everything seemed to be moving in harmony. James couldn't help but smile, realizing that despite the encounter earlier, the world was still a good place. It was full of kindness, and all he had to do was look for it. When he finally reached his apartment, he set the groceries down on the kitchen counter and took a moment to reflect. The officer's words may have stung, but they wouldn't define him. He had faced much worse in his life, and he would continue to face whatever came his way with the same quiet dignity that had always served him well. As he sat down at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The world had its flaws, but it also had moments of grace, and that was what he chose to focus on. With that thought, James looked out the window at the peaceful neighborhood, content in the knowledge that he had nothing to prove to anyone, and he was more than enough just as he was. As James settled into his quiet afternoon, sipping his tea, the earlier encounter with the officer still weighed on him, though he tried not to let it overshadow his day. He had learned long ago that it wasn't the cruelty of others that defined him, but how he responded to it. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Why had that officer been so quick to judge him? Why had he treated him with such disdain, as if he were just another problem to deal with, rather than a man who had lived a full life, who had served his country and earned his place in the world? James sat in his chair, the warm sunlight spilling through the window, as memories began to drift through his mind. He thought back to his years of service, to the places he had seen and the people he had met. He had been a young man, full of energy and hope, eager to serve. He had been through battles, seen comrades fall, and faced the harshest realities of war. Yet, no matter what he had experienced, he had always believed in the goodness of people. He had believed that, deep down, everyone had a sense of honor and respect for one another. But now, in the quiet of his apartment, James wondered if that belief had been naive. It seemed like the world had changed, and not necessarily for the better. He had seen progress in some ways, yes. People had more rights, more opportunities, and things were moving forward. But there were still deep divides, deep prejudices that seemed impossible to overcome. The officer's words echoed in his mind. People like you are always up to something. What did he mean by that? Was it because of his age, his race, or was it simply because James wasn't someone the officer thought fit in? Before he could dwell on these thoughts too long, there was a knock at his door. It was a soft, polite knock, a sound that broke his train of thought. James set his tea down and slowly made his way to the door, his joints creaking with every movement. He wasn't expecting anyone, but maybe it was one of the neighbors, someone who needed help with something, or perhaps someone just checking in. It wasn't uncommon for people to drop by occasionally. He opened the door to find a young woman standing on the other side. She was dressed casually, wearing a pair of jeans and a light jacket. There was a gentle smile on her face, and she seemed friendly enough. James didn't recognize her right away, but something about her presence felt warm, reassuring even. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thompson," the woman said, her voice soft and polite. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I just wanted to make sure you were all right." James raised an eyebrow, a little surprised. "Oh, I'm fine, thank you. But if you don't mind me asking, how do you know my name?" The woman smiled again, a little sheepish this time. "I'm actually one of the new neighbors. I just moved in across the hall last week. I've seen you around a few times, and I thought I'd introduce myself. My name is Sarah." James nodded, still a little taken aback, but warmed by her kindness. It had been a while since anyone had come by just to check on him. In the past, he'd had friends and neighbors who would drop by to chat, but as the years went by, the visits had become less frequent. People had their own lives, their own busy routines. Still, it was nice to see someone taking the time to reach out. "I appreciate the gesture, Sarah," James said, his voice genuine. "It's always nice to meet new neighbors." She smiled brightly. "I just wanted to make sure everything was going okay, especially after, well, I saw what happened earlier with the officer." James paused, surprised. He hadn't realized that anyone had witnessed the interaction, but now that Sarah mentioned it, he could see why she might have been concerned. "It was just a misunderstanding," he said, his voice calm but with a hint of sadness. "Nothing to worry about." Sarah seemed to sense the weight in his voice, and she quickly nodded. "I understand. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. Some of the younger officers can be a bit overzealous, I suppose." James chuckled softly, though there was no humor in it. "Overzealous," he repeated. "That's one way to put it." There was a brief silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Sarah didn't push him to talk more about the incident. Instead, she offered a simple, kind gesture. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to let me know. I'm just across the hall." James smiled, touched by her kindness. "Thank you, Sarah. I appreciate that more than you know." With that, Sarah gave him a final, warm smile before turning to leave. James stood in the doorway, watching her walk down the hall and disappear into her apartment. He felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. Maybe the world wasn't as cold as it seemed. Maybe, just maybe, there were still good people out there, willing to show kindness when it was needed most. The afternoon passed quietly, and as the day turned into evening, James found himself reflecting on the events that had unfolded. He sat in his chair, looking out of the window at the fading light of the sun as it sank below the horizon. The room was calm, filled with the soft hum of the world outside, but his thoughts were restless. The encounter with the officer had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It wasn't just the harsh treatment, but the way it made him feel small, like a person who didn't matter anymore. But in the midst of that sting, something else had happened, something he couldn't ignore. Sarah's kindness. When she had come by to check on him, it had reminded him of something important. There were still good people in the world, people who saw others not for their age, race, or past, but for the simple fact that they were human. He had nearly forgotten that there were people like her, willing to reach out, to care. It had been a long time since anyone had shown him such warmth, and it made him feel, for a moment, that he wasn't invisible, that he wasn't just a relic of a forgotten time. But his thoughts kept returning to the officer. That young man had no idea who James truly was. He didn't know the full extent of what James had seen and done in his life. The officer had seen a tired, elderly man with gray hair and slow steps. But James wasn't just the sum of his age and appearance. He was a man who had faced battles, both literal and metaphorical, a man who had given so much for a country that often forgot him. That officer had looked at him and seen only what he wanted to see, dismissing him with a few words. James shook his head as he pushed those thoughts aside. He had spent enough of his life dwelling on the past. His service, his struggles, they were part of who he was, but they didn't have to define him. The past was behind him, and what mattered now was how he carried himself moving forward. He had learned that lesson many years ago. Life was about resilience. It wasn't about fighting every battle, but knowing which ones were worth fighting, and when it was time to walk away with your head held high. The next morning, when James woke up, he felt a shift in his mindset. The weight of the officer's words still lingered, but it didn't feel as heavy as it had the day before. There was a sense of clarity now. He had faced worse, and he would continue to face whatever life threw at him. He couldn't change how others saw him, but he could control how he responded. He wasn't going to let that officer or anyone else steal his peace of mind. As he made his way to the kitchen for his usual cup of coffee, he found himself thinking about Sarah again. She had come by without any agenda, simply out of kindness. That small act had left a lasting impression on him. It was so rare to find someone who took the time to check in on an elderly neighbor, someone who didn't see him as just an old man, but as a person. The world seemed so quick to move on, to dismiss people who no longer fit into its fast-paced rhythm. But Sarah had reminded him that there was still room for compassion, for real connections. James sat at the table with his coffee, the steam rising from the cup, his hands resting on the warm ceramic. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to be still, to just be present in the moment. He had spent so many years fighting for survival, for respect, for recognition. But today, he decided to fight for something different, his own peace. As the day wore on, James went about his usual routine. He checked on his small garden outside, watered the plants, and took a walk around the block. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that he would continue to face it with the quiet strength he had carried all of his life. There would always be people who judged him, who saw him as nothing more than an old man, but there would also be those who saw him for who he truly was, someone who had lived a life of purpose, someone who still had something to offer. As he walked down the street, he noticed a few familiar faces, people who didn't hurry past him, who stopped to say hello or offer a kind word. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It reminded him that there was still kindness in the world, and that was worth more than any judgment from someone who didn't know him. When James returned to his apartment, he felt a sense of contentment he hadn't experienced in a long time. The encounter with the officer had shaken him, but it had also opened his eyes to something important. There was always room for kindness, and there was always a chance to make a connection with someone who truly saw you for who you were. And as long as that remained true, he would keep walking forward, head held high, with the quiet strength of a man who had seen much, but had not lost his faith in the good that still existed. The days passed quietly after the unsettling encounter with the officer, and James found a sense of peace settling back into his routine. The mornings began with the same calm, the sun rising slowly over the horizon as he sipped his coffee and reflected on the simplicity of his life. He had seen so much over the years, and as the years continued to pass, he had learned how to find solace in the small moments, in the little things that many others overlooked. One afternoon, as he was returning from a walk, he saw something that made him pause. It was Sarah, the young neighbor who had checked on him after the officer's encounter. She was standing outside her apartment, looking a bit flustered, as she tried to carry a large bag of groceries. James, noticing that she was struggling with the weight of the bag, approached her. "Let me help you with that," he called out as he neared her, offering a warm smile. Sarah looked up, surprised at first, but then smiled gratefully. "Oh, Mr. Thompson, you really don't have to. It's not that heavy." "Nonsense," James said with a chuckle, carefully taking the bag from her hands. "A little help goes a long way." Together, they walked towards her door. As they made their way down the hallway, Sarah started chatting, her voice light and easy. James couldn't help but notice how different she was from the officer, and not just in age. She seemed to have an openness, an understanding of others that made him feel comfortable. She wasn't looking at him like some relic of the past, someone to be dismissed. She saw him as a person, a neighbor, and that was all he needed. "Thank you, Mr. Thompson," Sarah said as they reached her door. "I've been so busy with work, I'm afraid I've neglected getting groceries for the past few days. James smiled and set the bag down on the table by the door. It's no trouble at all. We all get busy now and then. It's good to help one another when we can. Sarah nodded, her smile softening. I was actually thinking about you the other day after what happened with the officer. I didn't like the way he treated you. James was surprised to hear her mention it, but he appreciated the sincerity in her voice. It's all right, Sarah, he said with a wave of his hand. I've been through worse in my life. I know what it's like to be judged without people knowing the full story. Sarah looked at him with understanding, her eyes warm with empathy. That officer didn't seem to understand you at all. I could see that it bothered you, and it bothered me too. People like him think they know everything, but they don't understand what you've been through. James smiled, feeling a sense of gratitude toward her. It was rare to find someone who truly understood, someone who didn't just see him as an old man, but as a person with a history and a purpose. Thank you for saying that. It's nice to know someone sees things clearly. As they stood there for a moment, Sarah seemed to hesitate, as if considering something. Then she spoke up again. I was wondering if you'd like to join me for dinner sometime. I'm a decent cook, and I'd love to return the favor for all your kindness. You don't have to say yes if you don't want to, but it'd be nice to get to know you better. James was touched by the invitation. It had been so long since anyone had offered such a gesture, especially from someone so young. He didn't have much company these days, and the thought of sharing a meal with someone who truly cared was something he hadn't experienced in years. I'd like that very much, he said, his voice sincere. It's been a long time since I've had a nice dinner with company. Sarah's face lit up with a bright smile. Great. I'll make something simple, but I promise it'll be good. How about tomorrow evening? Tomorrow sounds perfect, James replied. They said their goodbyes, and as James made his way back to his apartment, he felt a sense of hope growing in his chest. It wasn't just about the dinner. It was about the fact that there were still people who took the time to see others for who they truly were. There were still kind hearts in the world, and not everyone was blinded by judgment or prejudice. Later that evening, as he prepared himself for bed, James reflected on the day. The officer's harsh words still echoed in his mind, but now they didn't carry the same weight. Sarah's kindness had washed over him like a breath of fresh air, and he was reminded that, despite the challenges and the injustices he had faced, there were still moments of beauty to be found. He didn't have to carry the bitterness of that encounter with him any longer. Instead, he could focus on the good, on the kindness of strangers, on the bonds formed over shared meals, and on the quiet strength that allowed him to face the world, no matter what it threw at him. Tomorrow, he would enjoy dinner with Sarah, but more than that, he would continue to move. The next evening, James found himself looking forward to dinner more than he had expected. It wasn't just the meal itself that excited him, but the warmth of human connection. It had been far too long since he had shared a table with someone, especially someone like Sarah, who seemed to truly see him for who he was. She hadn't just taken pity on him, as some might have done. No, Sarah had shown real kindness, and that was something he didn't take lightly. As he made his way to her apartment, he couldn't help but feel a sense of curiosity. What was it about this young woman that made her so different from so many others? She wasn't afraid to approach him, to ask how he was doing, to extend a hand of friendship. James had lived through many years, and he had met countless people, but it was rare to meet someone who took the time to understand, who wasn't quick to judge or assume. It made him feel seen in a way he hadn't felt in years. When he knocked on her door, it was opened almost immediately, and Sarah greeted him with a warm smile. "Come in, Mr. Thompson. I hope you're hungry." "I could eat a little," James replied with a chuckle. He stepped inside, noticing the smell of something delicious wafting from the kitchen. It wasn't an extravagant meal, but the aroma of freshly cooked food made it feel special. Sarah led him to the small dining table, where 2 plates were set. "I made a simple chicken stew. Nothing fancy, but I hope it's to your liking," she said, motioning for him to sit. James took his seat, the simplicity of the setting comforting. There was no grand display, no formality. Just two people sharing a meal, and that was enough. Sarah sat down across from him, and they began to eat. The conversation flowed easily between them, with Sarah asking him about his life, his time in the service, and the things he had learned over the years. She didn't rush through her questions or ask out of obligation. She genuinely seemed interested in what he had to say. As they spoke, James felt the weight of the world shift off his shoulders. For once, he wasn't defined by his age or his past. He was just a person sitting across from another person, sharing a quiet, pleasant evening. Sarah spoke about her own life, her job, her family, her hopes for the future, and James found himself listening intently, enjoying her stories as much as she had enjoyed his. It was a rare connection, one that didn't come from pity or obligation, but from mutual respect. As they finished their meal, Sarah stood up and cleared the table. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked. James smiled, feeling content. "Yes, that sounds nice." They sat together for a while longer, sipping coffee and talking about anything and everything. The world outside seemed distant and unimportant in that moment. It was just the two of them, enjoying the comfort of shared company, the warmth of a simple evening spent together. When the evening drew to a close, James stood up to leave, but not without a sense of gratitude. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice soft. "This has been a good evening. I don't think I've had one like this in a long time." Sarah smiled warmly, standing beside him. "It was my pleasure, Mr. Thompson. I'm really glad you came." As James made his way back to his apartment that night, he couldn't help but reflect on the past few days. What had started as a painful encounter with an officer had turned into something far more meaningful. It had reminded him of the importance of human connection, of kindness and respect. It had reminded him that, even in a world that could sometimes feel indifferent, there were still people who cared. He had faced much in his life, challenges, struggles, and moments of despair. But tonight, as he walked down the quiet street, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't invisible. He wasn't forgotten. There were still good people out there, and as long as there was kindness in the world, he would keep moving forward, grateful for every connection, every moment of understanding. James knew that life wasn't always easy, and there would still be days that tested him. But now, more than ever, he understood that he didn't have to face those days alone. There were people who saw him, who valued him, and that was enough. With that thought, he made his way back home, his heart a little lighter than before. He had made it through the hardest moments, and now he could face whatever came next with quiet strength and a renewed sense of hope.